Bon dia. A continuació podreu veure l'entrevista amb en Mojmir Mrak, professor d'Economia de la Universitat de Ljubljana. El professor Mrak va participar activament en la transició eslovena després de la seva independència de Iugoslàvia i és l'editor d'aquest llibre, on els actors claus d'aquest procés expliquen de primera mà com ho van fer possible. Si voleu aprendre més sobre Eslovènia, podeu escoltar l'entrevista que en Víctor Puig li va fer en Luka Lisjak, on parlen llargament sobre la història del país. Tots els enllaços seran a la descripció d'aquest vídeo. Així doncs, el Caceb us presenta l'entrevista amb Mojmir Mrak. Welcome. Today we have with us Professor Mojmir Mrak. Thank you for being here. We're here to talk about the last 3 decades of Slovenia, especially its financial evolution and its economic success. Under most accounts, Slovenia would count as a success story. It went from being a regional economy in Yugoslavia to a full member of the European Union. And according to World Bank data, in 2020, it surpassed Spain in GDP per capita, adjusting for purchasing power parity. So, for all its difficulties, it seems to have achieved its goals and to be in a good course. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of those Slovenians 30 years ago or a bit more, in the late 80s, early 90s. What were, if we put ourselves in the shoes of policymakers, economists and bankers and other people that were working in financial matters, what were the main issues that they were facing at that time?
Well, if we talk let's say the late 1980s, that was already a period when there was a pretty clear decision from the Slovenian side to leave former Yugoslavia. I would say that on the economic side, we have to take into account that the former Yugoslavia, so the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, defaulted in 1982. So we were in a defaulted country without any access to foreign funding. We were in circumstances where the Serbian nationalism was becoming stronger and stronger. And that was kind of an environment when the Slovenian, let's say, political leadership, and not just the leadership, also, of course, at that time, the population in general, somehow came to the conclusion that we will not be able to achieve our, if you want, strategic goals of Slovenians. And that was one of them was to join Europe. It's interesting, we were talking about joining Europe at the time we were still part of former Yugoslavia, but it was clear, at least that was a general conviction in Slovenia, that we will not be able to achieve this within the framework of Yugoslavia, because there were other priorities of other partners in former Yugoslavia. So it became obvious that we have first to become independent. And then, of course, if and when we become independent, then we will have our, let's say, own choice to join the, let's say, Euro-Atlantic integrations. I would say mainly the people were here considering the European Union. So that was a kind of, let's say, political framework. It was interesting, if you would be in Slovenia in the end of 1980s, one of the major slogans, so that was still the time of former Yugoslavia, was, Europe now. So, we were basically we were seeing ourselves in Europe. But of course, if we want to go to Europe, we have first to get out of Yugoslavia. So that's, I think, is important to understand this framework. Based on this, I would say then all these political things were done in Slovenia in a way which were, I would say, according to the legislation. We had this referendum for exiting the Yugoslavia and so on. We have to be aware that we also were in a little bit different political situation than, let's say, Croatia. Why our situation was different? We never had in Slovenia a Serbian population, which would be a population, let's say from centuries back, that you would have certain parts of the country where the Serbian population would be in a majority, what was the case in Croatia from the Middle Ages, when, because a lot of Serbs came to Croatian territory to defend Austro-Hungarian Empire, and some parts of Croatia were inhabited with the majority Serbian population. I'm talking about Lika, I'm talking about some other parts. In Slovenia, the Serbian population was coming here more or less in the form of the economic, let's say, immigration. They were all over the parts, but it was a completely different story. That's my point to underline. That also, from the side of the Serbian, these nationalist forces, they never saw Slovenia the same way as Croatia, because the origin, the region was completely different. This is why I am saying this, is because it was also relatively easier then to explain why, if you want, Milosevic was in a way, even eager to get rid of Slovenia. Because Slovenia would complicate his life in that area which he would like to be dominated by the Serbs. So that was why also our exit from Yugoslavia was, of course, we did have some war elements here in the June 1991. So it was basically, I would say, this independence was also achieved through the very strong confrontation with at that time, Yugoslav army. But the point you have to say is that Yugoslav army then kind of relatively quickly determined that, their interests in Slovenia are not that strong. And so this is a bit of a framework. So we became independent. There was, of course, all this issue with recognition. We were fighting for more than a year to be formally recognized, or not formally, roughly 1 year. I'm talking here about the UN, the EU member states. At that time, there were still ideas, to keep the former Yugoslavia one or another way in one piece. And I remember the first years of independent Slovenia, it was not so clear to everybody that, Yugoslavia fell apart, and this is now done. We have to live with the new reality. So the beginning of our independence, I would say from 91 till 94, 5, we were basically trying to establish this Slovenia as a sovereign state. This is also what you mentioned in your question. We had to put in place a number of institutions which were not there before, as we were part of the former Yugoslavia. We also lost a significant market, which was in the former Yugoslavia. So we had to restructure our economy. Here we have to be fair that Yugoslavia did not have a central planning system. We had a system which was economic term. It was a kind of the self-management system, which in certain elements it was much better to do this transition, but on some other elements it was more difficult. Maybe there will be a possibility to discuss this later. But one point which was at that time relatively important was that our companies, the trade of our companies, export, import, was not done through central planning companies. So, companies were doing this by themselves. So the business community, the managers, they did have exposure to the market already at the times of former Yugoslavia. So for them, this transition going from the Yugoslav markets to Western market was not that much of a problem. Then we would have it in case that these companies will be without any trading components, skills, and so on. So this explains, that our economic shock immediately after we declared independence was, of course, very strong. but it was relatively quickly, how would I say, overrun, dealt with. So already in 1993, Slovenia started to grow again. So, the shock was really 91, 92, 93. We were already, getting back. I'm not saying that the situation was perfect, but it has become more normal. So that was one thing, that our basis was different than in other, let's say, ex-socialist countries. Another thing which I would say was very important was more on the monetary side. When we declared independence in June 91, we were, of course, continue to be part of the monetary system of former Yugoslavia. So we still had Yugoslav dinars as a paying system here. But one of the problems which we were faced was that, former Yugoslavia, and that means at that time also the newly independent Slovenia, was faced with a very high inflation. We were talking about the inflation rate, which was over 20% a month. So you can imagine that was clear that we have to do something very quickly to delink from the Yugoslav monetary system. So that was the reason why the Slovenian policymakers, and in this context, particularly the Slovenian Central Bank, very quickly came to the conclusion that we have to introduce our own currency as quickly as possible. There was no simply time to say, okay, we will now put this everything nicely, prepare these things, and we will do this in a year time. There was no time. So that explains why we basically started with our own national currency already in October 1991. But just to give you a sense, since we did not have time to prepare the banknotes, the coins, and so on, so we were basically living for half a year. I'm talking between October 91 and somewhere spring, was it March or April? I'm not sure. Not with the money, so with the new dollars, but we were basically living with a kind of Ministry of Finance bills. So it was kind of a bonds which were used to bridge from one currency to another currency. And of course, that was the issue of the potential problems with the falsification and so on. But now looking back, the whole experiment was done pretty well. We then sometimes in spring 1992, we did introduce currency. So that was the dollar. There were, of course, a lot of discussion at that time what kind of exchange rates to take. There was a strong arguments and also proposals of foreign consultants to go with the currency board. But there was one major problem why currency board was not really appropriate for us. Would be very appropriate as an instrument for killing inflation. But there was one big problem with this. For a currency board, you need foreign exchange reserves.
Right.
Foreign exchange reserves at the time when we declared independence were zero, because the foreign exchange reserves were in Belgrade, and we did not have access to those foreign exchange reserves, even though they were partly ours. And so Yugoslavia at that moment had roughly $10 billion of foreign exchange reserves. And of course, we did contribute to these reserves, but we did not have access to them. And so that was not, you should not forget that was already time when the war started in some other parts of former Yugoslavia, particularly Croatia, and then later on Bosnia. So this was pretty unpleasant situation. So we basically declared, to go into a currency. In these circumstances, there was then no other, let's say, reasonable solution but to go to a managed float. So we decided to go with the managed floats, and then we stayed in the managed floats practically throughout the 1990s, throughout the moment when we joined the EU. And then we will probably talk about this later on. We also decided for a very quick accession to the euro area. So we had our own currency, if you want, from October 91 till January 1st, 2007. Slovenia was the first of the new EU member states which joined the euro area. So if I go back now to this beginning of Slovenia, so yeah, we were for the first half of the 90s more or less busy how to put our country, in a shape of being a sovereign state. We were a little bit now, of course, late because we had all these issues with this approach towards the European Union. Compared to countries like Hungary, Poland, when their transition started, and that was, I'm talking 91, they were basically immediately trying to, to go towards the EU. So they started to strengthen these institutional positions. We did not have this possibility to do because, we were basically busy with other things. There was another thing which was, I think, very important in the context of the EU accession. That's my conviction is, I think it would be very difficult for Slovenia to start EU accession negotiations if we will not resolve the relationship with foreign creditors. So that was, if you want, that was my cup of tea. I returned back to Slovenia in beginning of 1992, but when I was asked at that time by our prime minister at that time, Janez Drnovšek, basically to take over all the negotiations with foreign creditors. And the idea was to establish Slovenia, to constitute Slovenia also independent in financial terms. Independent means that we have to resolve our unresolved issues with the foreign creditors. And don't forget, if you remember, I said at the beginning that Yugoslavia defaulted in 82. And when Slovenia declared independence, we declared independence from an defaulted state. And for many of those debts of former Yugoslavia, we were jointly liable. And being jointly liable is not a very pleasant situation when you want to start solving the relationship with the creditors. So I spent then basically the period between 1992 and 1996, more or less in these negotiations with various groups of foreign creditors. First, it was how to become a member of multilateral institutions, how to divide the debt towards these institutions. Then we had the issue with the Paris Club, London Club. I'm not sure that this is very interesting for your audience, but of course I can be here much more detailed how this was done. What I can say is that the allocation of the Yugoslav debt was done very, very different than allocation of the debts of former Soviet Union. The principles were completely different. And what I can say is Slovenia was the first one doing these agreements with the foreign creditors. So we can basically say that the Yugoslav debt was by and large allocated among the former Yugoslav republics based on the arrangements, I'm talking conceptually arrangements, made by Slovenia with this group of creditors. So that was, in this respect, that was, I would say, for us very useful. In 1996, we fully completed all these negotiations. We established our external debts. We basically got a rating. We didn't want to get a rating before knowing how much you owe. So, and, it's interesting, maybe from today's perspective, Slovenia got in 1996 a rating which was single A, which tells you something. It was by far the highest rating in the region. But of course, that was possible at the moment when we cleared the table related to external debts. When I say cleared, when it became clear how much we owe, and then of course the rest is not then our obligation under this joint and several liability clause. And then, of course, when this was resolved, then we were also were able to go, let's say, more actively towards the EU. These institutional things we did catch up. We had some initial problems with bilateral problems with Italy related to some specific issues which were coming back till after the Second World War, but that were resolved. So Slovenia was then, luckily, if you want, included in the first group of the 6 countries, which then started the negotiations for accession to the EU. And I would say that during these negotiations, these 5 years between 98, because the negotiations started 98, and they were finished in 2022. I think at the end of the negotiations, I can say that Slovenia was among those countries which were negotiating for accession. I think we were the best prepared country. Why? Somebody will say, how you would judge this? Well, I will give you one very simple indication. The last year, 2002, we were basically waiting the other candidate countries at that time to finish their negotiations, because the financial package is always done together. But we have done everything but financial package much earlier than the others, what means that we had to wait then for the others. When I say for the others, basically, I would say the decision when the enlargement will be done was basically done at the moment when the old member states came to the conclusion that Poland is considered to be ready, and because it's because of the market and so on. So important. So that was I would say that period between the independence and the accession to the EU was in many respects, I would say, pretty successful. That was already a period where we were doing also quite a bit of a catch-up, a real convergence. When Slovenia joined the EU, we were somewhere at the level of over 70% of GDP per capita in purchasing power parity compared to the EU average. So we were at that time by far the most close to the EU average. So we were at that moment the most developed among the new member states, or if you want, candidate countries. And I can tell you, because of this, we also had some specific problems in the EU accession negotiation, because I was involved also in the accession negotiations, but mainly on this financial side, which I'm still doing today for the Slovenian government. So that's, I would say, is the period up to the EU accession. I think we were always considering in Slovenia EU accession together with the euro, accession to the euro. So that was I would say, pretty clear conclusion already sometime, when we were finalizing the EU accession negotiations, that it would make sense for us also to join euro as quickly as possible. Of course, maybe if this decision would come later, then maybe there would be some other arguments. But at that moment, I think the arguments were very clear. There were several of them. Let me mention just few of them. One reason was that we export roughly 60-70% of everything what we produce. And of course, our major partners are in the EU, Euro area. So joining the Euro area would mean eliminating all the currency risks for these trades. And I'm talking here, it's a significant macro issue. Second thing, very important, Slovenia, we introduced our own currency, but we were always an extremely small monetary area. And, if you are such a small area, you are potentially very exposed to potential currency attacks. And by joining the euro, we eliminate this risk. Very important argument in favor. Third thing, we had at that time very good fiscal performance. If you would look, our debt was roughly maybe somewhere around 25% of GDP. So we were, easily within the Maastricht criteria. We were also easily within the Maastricht respect to the public debt. So there was no argument on the fiscal side to wait. So we were aware that our population is aging. if we were postponing this, we will have on the fiscal side just more problems. So this was, I would say, again, a pretty strong argument in favor of this. So I would say these were the major issues which were decisive for this decision. Of course, if we would do this 10 years later, then of course maybe there would be some stronger counter arguments in context of the costs which are being paid through the financial crisis and so on. But look, I would say even today, the polls which are being done, I think euro is one of the things which the population in general still considers, supports very, very strongly. So I think it was a good, by and large, it was a good decision. But of course, we did have also in the context of this some problems, which of course, if you are interested, we can talk in continuation of this our discussion.
Okay. So from all the topics that were brought up, let's go into the choice of a new currency. So you're facing hyperinflation, and you're facing that you have no reserves because you don't have access to the Yugoslav central bank. There was, however, this central bank in Slovenia that was in some sense subordinate to the rank of Yugoslavia, right? So what at the moment of the monetary transition, what is the so please walk us through it. How does it happen?
Okay. Yeah, in Yugoslavia, we had a central banking system, which was, a little bit similar what we are having today in the Eurozone. So in Yugoslavia, we had 6 republics, and each of the republic had its own central bank. So we had Central Bank of Slovenia. This does not mean that these institutions had the possibility to print the money, because they were part. The central banks of individual republics were part of the Yugoslav central bank system. And on the top of this system was the National Bank of Yugoslavia, what was the central bank of the former Yugoslavia. So that was then, of course, the institution which was also, if you want, having a printing machine, to simplify a little bit. So of course, this means that these guys in central banks of republics, they were monetary economies. So you did have some knowledge about the monetary policy. Also, I remember when Yugoslavia was constantly in problems with foreign exchange reserves and so on. We were constantly under standby arrangements. And also the people from the IMF, where the major counterpart in Yugoslavia was Narodna Banka Yugoslavia, but they were coming to Slovenia because they had very interesting counterparts to talk with in the Bank of Slovenia. So I would say we did have in the central bank quite knowledge of the monetary policy. And I think that was a very useful let's say, basis for the moment when this decision was taken, guys, we have to introduce our own currency. And so these people, together with some people from outside of the central bank, here I'm talking mostly about a couple of professors, Professor Ribnikar and so on, and from some institutes, they basically constituted a group of people. That was a group within the central bank, which was then de facto preparing this monetary independence, if you want. So it was done within the framework of the central bank. Of course, everything was done in coordination with the government of Republic of Slovenia, but still, it was the central bank which was doing this. I know that they were, at the moment when we were introducing the currency, or let's say that was summer 1991, so we were still part of this monetary arrangement in Yugoslavia. They were basically intense discussion, which way to go to a new currency, and there were two options on the table. One option was the currency board. so that we would go into currency boards. So that was also strongly supported by a group of foreign consultants. One name was here very, very famous. It still is. Jeffrey Sachs was basically, and his group of advisors was basically advocating that Slovenia should go into a currency board. You had, I told you, one strong counter argument, and this counter argument was that we don't have foreign exchange reserves. So technically, this would still be possible to be done, but it would be very risky. And you're a consultant, then you may propose things to see how the fish will fly in that water. If you are decision making, then you make these decisions probably taking some other considerations more, into consideration. There was another thing which I think was very important, which again needs a little bit of explanation for going back to former Yugoslavia. Because of hyperinflation of former Yugoslavia in the 80s, people used to have their money not in local currency, but in German marks. So we were, that was legally. We did have in banks 2 accounts. One was the dinar account, and another was a Deutschmark account. So when I was getting a salary in 89, 87, the first thing what I have done was to change the dinars into the Deutschmarks. Because if I will do this in 3 days, I already lost quite some money. So what I want to say, the people basically had their money in Deutschmark accounts. So the deposits were more or less in the accounts in foreign currency. So now you are introducing your own new currency. So if the central bank would like to go into a currency board, they would have to change the Deutsch account into the new dollar accounts. I'm not saying that they would take money from the people, but the accounts will have to be changed. And now imagine the people did not have a very strong belief in currency of former Yugoslavia, so they were very disillusioned with the national currency. Why, by definition, they would have a good view on the currency of the newly established state? So what I want to say, it was considered political economy quite risky to do this, that you would close these the Deutschmark accounts. So that were the 2 reasons why then the central bank decided to go into the managed float. And then, of course, that was then in terms of the foreign exchange reserves much more doable. I remember the first significant foreign exchange reserves of Slovenia were generated by selling socially owned flats to the population. Imagine, I'm a company and my employees are in flats which are owned by that company, socially owned. And under the legislation from 1993, 94, there was a general decision that these socially owned flats should be sold to the population at a relatively good price. And that was the price at that time was roughly, 20% of the market price. So everybody was buying this, and the people were basically taking their Deutschmark savings from wherever they had them, and they became owners of the flat, which they were living there anyway before. And that was the way how we generated the first, I think, roughly 400 million Deutschmarks of foreign exchange reserves. That was I think it was 1990 or 93. So it was a very, very, I would say now looking back, a very good policy decision. Generally, I would say that this policy making in the first decade of Slovenia was a relatively good one. I'm not saying that there were not some mistakes. One of the major problems, which became problem later on, was our process of privatization. We went very differently with the privatization than many of the other these Central Eastern countries. We went into this process through the so-called internal privatization. So basically, we were distributing shares to the people working in the companies. Don't forget that we used to have self-management economic system. What means that the people, the workers, were considering companies as their companies. So these were
Was
not.
it the
This
same
was not.
concept in the commercial banks?
That was done through the independent institutions, not through the banks. But
No,
we
I mean
did.
the banks were privatized in the same way.
Yeah, the banks were then done. This was a similar way, but the banks were basically at that time all still state-owned banks. But there is one big difference. We did have commercial banks in former Yugoslavia.
Uh,
If you will go to the Baltic states, to Poland, to these countries with centrally planned economic system, they did not have banking sector. So, you know, our banking sector was not perfect, but there was a banking sector. If you wanted that this banking sector will operate, you had to restructure it. In the case of Baltic states, there was nothing to restructure because there was no banking. So for them, to open the system to foreigners was very logical. In our case, it was a little bit different because you did have your own system. And of course, what did you want is that this system is structured and that it will be also beneficial for your development. So, it did have the logic at that time, but it has proved to be also with a lot of counter.
and with regards to the hyperinflation, how did Slovenia manage to get the confidence of the population in the new currency and
No,
drive?
with this, basically the inflation went down also with this managed float relatively quickly down. We had always higher inflation, of course, than Germany, but we are not talking anymore about hyperinflation. So the currency has basically been very successful in bringing down inflation. But of course, we have to be fair. Currency boards would be here even more brutal in bringing down inflation. So currency board, there is no doubt, currency board is extremely efficient in bringing down inflation. But as I told you, there were few strong counter arguments which prevailed in Slovenia not to go into that type of the regime.
And what was it always from the start? Was it always clear that the ultimate goal was to join the European change mechanism and also maybe
Look,
their own
don't
the euro?
don't
Or
forget, in 91, we are talking 91. 91, there was no yet a decision to go to the euro at all. There was a euro was decided with the Maastricht Treaty, which was 1993. So when we
there
were
wasn't even the expectation?
so look, the euro has become really a currency only in 1999. So we did not talk at the time of former Yugoslavia and at the beginning of Slovenia about joining euro because there was at that time no euro.
Yeah.
So we started to talk about the euro very seriously at the time when we started the negotiations for accession to the EU. So I remember already in the 1998, 1999, so that was the time when the euro was actually introduced. That was already the moments when there was a very clear kind of views that Slovenia should join Europe as quickly as possible after joining the EU. And then, of course, that was more or less then followed, because I don't know to what extent you know the process of entering into the euro area. You have to meet 5 conditions. One is that your inflation rate is close to the level of the euro area inflation. The interest rate is there. Then you need to have the fiscal criteria. And then you need to fix your exchange rate of your currency towards the euro. And in Slovenia, we fixed the exchange rate already in June 2004. So practically 1 month after joining the EU, we already fixed the exchange rate of dollar vis-a-vis the euro. And the condition says that you have to stay in this ERM2 for at least 2 years. So it means if we fix this in June 2004, that period expired in June 2006. Since at that moment, the ministers of finance, the ECOFIN, came to the conclusion that we are indeed meeting all the 5 criteria, then at that moment, then the final decision was made by the ECOFIN that Slovenia may join the euro with the January 1st, 2007. But what I would like here to underline, even though we joined in January 2007, we have de facto fixed the exchange rate already 2.5 years before that. And in a way, you can also say that by fixing the exchange rates in this way, we de facto lost our independent national monetary policy, not in 2007, but already in mid-2004.
Okay. So now let's move to the issue where you said before that you had a personal party, the issue of external debt.
Okay.
So in the chapter of your book, you stress that the priority at the time, it seemed to be, before talking to creditors, to access the institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. So why was that, and how did it work?
Yeah, look, when we declared independence, so we declared independence from a defaulted country. That was a moment when Slovenia and Slovenian entities did not have any access to foreign financing. And I'm not talking here commercial bank loans, there was no bonds, there was nothing. We were not members of international financial institutions, so no IMF, no EBRD, nothing. So at that time, the decision was that, of course, we want to resolve the debt issue. To resolve, this does not mean that we will pay everything, but basically to normalize the relationship, to establish what proportion of this Yugoslav debt is actually ours. And then, of course, that's what is considered to be ours. This will be serviced regularly. But what is the rest? We are not anymore jointly liable for the rest. The main problem here was that this our strategy was done at the moment when we had a war in other parts of former Yugoslavia. So it was not possible to talk with the others in former Yugoslavia to do this. So we basically had to talk directly, bilaterally with different group of creditors. But now imagine, now I'm talking with commercial banks, which look their claims, not their claims against Slovenia, but their claims against the total former Yugoslavia. And you would like now to discuss only the Slovenian portion. From their perspective, they had basically to make a decision. Are they ready to go with these bloody Slovenians ahead? Or they should first get a whole picture for whole Yugoslav debt. So I can tell you, we spent more than 2 years convincing banks to go with us into a separate agreement. Because it was clear if they accept to go with us into a separate agreement, that means that then they will have to deal with the rest of the debt by themselves. And for them, of course, another problem was that even if they would be ready to go with Slovenia for a separate agreement, they would resolve a relatively small proportion of the total Yugoslav debt. Because the proportion of the Slovenian debt was below 20%. So what will happen from their perspective with the remaining 80%? And for this remaining 80%, under the existing contracts, Slovenia is jointly liable. Does it make sense for banks to cut this contract and then to go with Slovenia for 20%, and then they will, try to search what to do with the remaining 80s? I'm just trying to give you a sense. It was not a very clear-cut decision on the side of the banks, so they needed more than 2 years to come to the conclusions, okay, let's go separately with Slovenia. But when they said, let's go separately with Slovenia, it became clear that they are taking on board that then they will do individually with each of them. Eventually, don't forget, the war was going on in Bosnia at that time. So when they will get something back from both Macedonia, Serbia, and so on. So that was the general framework. We also wanted to get some new funding, at least from certain sources. And then, of course, we considered that the first realistic chances that we can get these from multilateral financial institutions. But of course, if I want to get a loan from the EBRD, IBRD, I have to become a member of these institutions. Because at that moment, we were not a member. So there was a big issue. Then, of course, we applied immediately for the membership in these institutions. But then there was a big issue. What should be the formula? What should be the legal way to accept Slovenia as a member, let's say, of the IMF? So, look, I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the IMF logic, but within the IMF, each country which becomes a member of the IMF gets its own quota, or let it put it differently, the quota is being calculated for that country. And the quota depends on the GDP, export, imports, reserves, and so on. And of course, immediately the question, when we applied for the membership, the first question was, what legally happened in former Yugoslavia? Because if Yugoslavia fell apart, and now we have on the territory of former Yugoslavia 5 equal successors, then we have to allocate the quota of former Yugoslavia to each of these, proportionally. That's one legal concept. Another legal concept, which was basically favored by Serbia, was no. We, Serbia, are the only legal successor of former Yugoslavia. So what does it mean? If you would like to become a new member, Slovenia, then you have to get your own new quota. So as you see, these are two legally completely different concepts.
Yes.
And of course, for joining the IMF had to take a decision on this issue. So that's what I can tell you. That was a big issue among the G7 countries. What legally happened? Well, I can be here very blunt. I think at that time, the decision was taken that Yugoslavia fell apart. So that was basically the attitude which we, Croats, Macedonians, and Bosnians, considering that that's actually happens. But I told you, the Serbia was of the opposite. And you had also among the G7 countries with one or another view. Here, I think the US has at that time still was, the kind of the most influential G7 country. And basically the decision at the G7 level was that for the purpose of the IMF membership, Yugoslavia fell apart. And then that was clear. So, you guys are joining in a way that each of you will get a portion of the quota and then also a portion of the debt which Yugoslavia had towards the IMF. So that was, if you want, that was something what we wanted to have, because that created a nice precedent for the negotiations with other groups of creditors. So once we got this membership, it was clear one precedent. And then we started the negotiations with the Paris Club. Paris Club is a club of the creditor states, which are at the same time also the main shareholders in the IMF. So you can imagine if they supported something in the IMF, it is not really very convincing not to support the same approach also within the Paris Club. So, and we reached also this deal on these similar lines with the Paris Club. But we have to be here not detail, the basic issue here is the structure of the Yugoslav debt. Yugoslavia had, when it defaulted, it had 15 billion US dollars of debt. And what was our proposal from the beginning, that Slovenia is ready to take over all the debt which was used in the territory of former of Slovenia, and that we are also ready to take over a proportion of that part of the debt which you cannot allocate among the republics. So the principle which we introduced and which we proposed to the creditors was that we take over the total so-called allocated debt and a proportion of non-allocated. So since the IMF debt is non-allocated among the republics, it was in the group of non-allocated debt. So it means the membership in the IMF has provided us a good precedent for allocation of non-allocated debt. So our proposal to the Paris Club was, dear Paris Club members, we are ready to take over the total Slovenian allocated debt plus the proportion of non-allocated debt which was agreed with the IMF. So that was a proposal which was not very easy for the Paris Club not to accept, because it was logical. It was also, let's say, if you're relevant, it was in economic terms proportionate. So the Paris Club then adopted this. But of course, when they adopted this, they have de facto set a precedent for making precisely the same type of an arrangement with all the former Yugoslav republics. So the principle for allocation of a Paris Club debt was that the republic, now new sovereign state, takes over its total allocated debt plus a proportion of non-allocated debt which was assigned to that country within the IMF. So to be precise, when we were offering the deal to the Paris Club, we said we are taking over the total allocated debt plus 16.1% of non-allocated debt of former Yugoslavia, because that was a percentage what we got in the IMF for the quotas, for the membership, and also for the debts. And that was then accepted by the Paris Club members. The third group of creditors, which was for us the most difficult one, were the commercial banks. And we intentionally wanted to have first an agreement with the Paris Club, because we basically, now this is that much far away it's not anymore a kind of secret or whatever. We said that we will propose to the London Club, to the commercial banks, precisely the same deal as to the Paris Club. So the total allocated debt plus 16.1% of non-allocated debt. But there is one major problem with the debt of commercial banks. For that part of the debt, all the republics were jointly liable. So that basically meant the banks said to me when I was negotiating with them, guys, you are liable for the total amount. So we cannot discuss about the proportion. You are jointly liable for 100, which of course they were aware that we were not be able to pay, that we will not be paying, but that was their legal position. And I must say, based on the contract, there were some arguments in favor of this. So this is why we, as I told you, we were basically waiting for practically more than 2 years in these negotiations with the banks, that at one point, I think that was 1994, that they said, okay, now, after all this period, we are ready to go with you in a separate agreement, but our proposal is that you take over 35% of the Yugoslav debts. And I remember very well when I came back to Ljubljana, after that round of the negotiations, I made basically kind of a statement that an important breakthrough was made in the negotiations. And some of the journalists interpreted this that Mrak is ready to take over 35%, which was, of course, a nonsense. Why this was a major breakthrough? It was a major breakthrough because it was the first time that the banks basically said, okay, we are ready to go into a separate contract with Slovenia. That Slovenia will take over a proportion of the debt, and for the rest, it will not be anymore jointly liable. So that was a major breakthrough. We needed another 2 years to finish these negotiations. And now, I can say that we finished these negotiations roughly at 16% of the total debt toward the London club. So, but what this deal meant, it meant that we have for each creditor from the London club, if the lender had a claim towards former Yugoslavia for 100, that guy would receive a bond of Republic of Slovenia for 16. What for the remaining 484? That's his business. So then he was trying to search for other solutions. And when we were negotiating this, we said that for these 16%, we do not need debt restructuring. So we are ready to repay this according to the existing schedule, because it was never a problem for us that we pay our debt, but we were ready to pay other debts. And once this deal was reached, also with the London club, then we also asked for the rating. And of course, this was then logical that the debt of Slovenia was then roughly, I'm talking about 15-17% of the Yugoslav debt. So the Yugoslav debt was 15 billion. We are then talking about 2 and something. And then, of course, 2 billion for Slovenia already at that time was not a major issue. And that gives you the explanation why we also got then the rating, which was single A rating, and it was basically the rating by all the 3 rating agencies. So they jointly, I'm not saying jointly, but they all came to the conclusion that this is now over, that now Slovenia has put a normal access to financial markets. And I would say that was very important also as an element for the beginning of the negotiations with the EU. I would say that was an important element also of credibility that we can deliver what we discuss. That was a time when also in Slovenia, it was possible to talk opposition about those things which were really important for Slovenia as a state. Because these negotiations, we had to do everything through the parliament to get a negotiating mandate, and to get the negotiating mandate in a way that not just the figure is given there, then you can just send an email to the bank to have a mandate to reach a sensible.
So until that point where you get the rating and you have an open door to the global money market, how did Slovenia manage to fund itself? If it had any needs?
Look, first we became member of the IMF, IBRD, EBRD, all these institutions already in 1992. So within 1 year after independence. So, immediately when we became a member of the IBRD, then we were eligible to get new loans from the IBRD. The same thing is with the EBRD. Also, the European Investment Bank was at that time already eligible for us, even though we were not a candidate at that time, but still. So I would say already 92, 93, access to multilateral financial institutions was established. Another thing very important is that we were able to start raising money in the form of syndicated loans. So for a syndicated loan, you do not need a rating. You do need a rating for issuing a bond. for a syndicated loan, rating is fine, but it's not obligatory. So the first syndicated loan, which was arranged by Republic of Slovenia, was already in 1993. Of course, at a very high margin. That's clear. And already the 94 was a better, the 95 was better, and then immediately when we got the rating, then of course these conditions were, would say, normal. But we started to get access to international, particularly banking markets, already in 1993. That was we had a very interesting, this was a time where we were negotiating with creditor banks for the old Yugoslav debt. You have a kind of rule among the banks that they do not provide fresh money to debtors who did not resolve the old debts. That's a kind of an unwritten rule. So it was one, I would say, our strategic objective to make a syndicated loan, even though it will be a little bit more expensive, but just to reach it, to show that we can do this. And it has proven to be very useful also to how would I say, to intensify negotiations about debt restructuring. Because when these banks I was negotiating for debt restructuring saw that we can get some money, even though the debt deal was not done, they saw that, if they would be very nasty, we can still live. And that was, I would say, a very strategic and very important message sent to them. We were always playing, guys, we would like to reach an agreement with you. But, if you are unreasonable, now we can live also without resolving this. We would like to do this, but, be let's say, reasonable. I must say, they were also, these were banks, but also banks were aware that they cannot get from Slovenia the total amount back. So it was clear that, it's difficult now to push small Slovenia having roughly 15-20%, to be liable for the total amount. It's not realistic. They are not stupid. Also, they had, I would say, pretty strong messages from the, let's say, officials. Be reasonable with Slovenia. They would like to resolve this issue. They would like to pay, but, don't be unreasonable. So that was a kind of a positive attitude of the, let's say, of the US authorities, of German authorities. They never forced banks to do whatever, but they basically gave them a signal, be reasonable. And, these guys would like normalize things. They are the only ones in former Yugoslavia doing relatively normally. We recognize them, you should not kill them now. So, that's I think that's general framework was positive, and that helped in the negotiations. That helped in the negotiations.
So, to move a bit more to the human side of things, I want to ask about the talent and the education and the human capital, let's say, of the expert groups or class, the people that were doing these negotiations, these transformations, institution building in a small country like Slovenia, especially if talented people are living abroad. How did you manage this?
Look, yeah, you're right. But I would say, there was a lot of enthusiasm in Slovenia putting in place your own sovereign state. We are always dreaming about these kind of things. So I think at the beginning of the 90s, quite a number of people returned to Slovenia basically to do this kind of things. So I was in Vienna, and so I came back in Slovenia to take over these negotiations. And I know at least 5 other people who were then, for example, the Minister of Finance, Gaspari. He was working in the World Bank. He came back basically to become a finance minister. So I would say at that time there was quite a number of professionals which kind of were consider this as their, if you want, duty, their unique opportunity. I don't know, whatever you would like to say, to come back. And I think that's was. We are not talking here about hundreds of people, so we are talking about a relatively small number of people. But those ones, many of those ones were then involved in these things, which were very, very important. And yet, somebody who was also coming to take over to Ljubljana, to take over one of the largest banks, was also coming. He was also a very high official in the World Bank. So, but I want to tell you that basically at that time, working for the states and newly independent state was something what, well, I would not say to consider as your duty, but it was really a unique opportunity, unique chance to do something.
And in other chapters of the book, they also mentioned that the international institutions played a role in knowledge transfer, in teaching and doing transfer of skills. How important would you say that those were?
Oh, that's, I don't remember that we said in this
Okay.
this book. I mean, yeah, look, we had we very much established all these links, contacts to the membership in these multilateral financial institutions, not just financial, but also in the other economic institutions. We were also already at that time wanted to join the OECD, but that was, for example, one thing which we were, if you want, delayed. And we were delayed because of our independence procedures, because at that time, the OECD closely opened the door for the Visegrad 4 countries, and that was it. And already 92, they, in a way, closed it. They said, yeah, this is for these 4, but not for the others. So we then became a member of OECD, I think, in 2010, and much, much later. But generally, I would say this knowledge transfer was done in very different areas, but not that would be, what I say, so important issue, at least at that moment.
Okay. So to get to the closing of the interview, where do you think that Slovenia stands now, especially with relating to the euro? If in hindsight it was a good decision, what's the thinking in Slovenia? And yeah, what is the current outlook?
Yeah, we focus very much on the period up to the accession to the EU and to the euro. Maybe I still have to say a few words about period after that. Look, one lesson which I can draw now for going back is that we did not really well understood the macroeconomic implications of joining the euro. Euro, not EU, euro. So basically, that was a time when Slovenia we joined the euro. We had still inflation, which was higher. We still had inflation, which were interest rates, which were higher than in the EU, than in the euro area. So that towards the euro accession was a period where we had a very strong economic growth, and that growth was very strong, based primarily on domestic consumption, domestic consumption, and this consumption was largely financed by borrowing. But where? Borrowing abroad. Right. Don't forget, inflation rate in Slovenia, interest rates in Slovenia were higher than abroad. So what did the banks do? Instead of generating their deposits here, they went abroad to borrow abroad and bring the foreign proceeds in Slovenia. That was a pressure on the exchange rate. So I will not elaborate here, but we had basically in the years 2005, 6, 7, an extremely high economic growth. We are talking the growth rates close to 7%, which is abnormal for Slovenia. It's not a normal economic growth. So we had basically a period of overheating. That was a period where, of course, also because of high growth, the taxes, the public finance revenues were increasing very fastly. And what the authorities done at that time, they also adjusted expenditures to these very high abnormal revenues. So at the moment when then in 2009, the financial crisis erupted, then of course we entered into a major fiscal crisis. So we overheated the economy, and then the crisis, the euro, particularly the financial crisis, and then later on the euro crisis, hit us relatively more than EU as a whole. Just to give you a sense, in 2008, Slovenia was already on over 90% of the EU average in per capita GDP purchasing power parity, more or less at the same level as we are today. But what happened in between is that in 2010, 2011, we went down to roughly 83%. So what does it tell you? It tells you that we were hit much stronger than the EU average. We had the problem with the banking sector. We had the problem with the enterprise sector. So in 2013, Slovenia was practically on the edge of default. Now we were very close to Troika, to these things, what you experienced in some of the other countries in that part of the Europe. We escaped the Troika, but we escaped the Troika by very hard domestically implanted fiscal adjustments. So we have done more or less similar things as in other countries of the Southern Europe, but without the Troika. So very strong fiscal adjustments, privatization of banks, a lot of other things. Slovenia was among the worst guys in the EU. We had excessive budgetary procedure. We had excessive macroeconomic procedure, name it. So we then slowly started to go back. And I would say before the COVID crisis, we came back to, let's say, more or less normal. But as I told you, so we had a big boom and bust phase in the second decade of our EU membership. Very high costs. So I would say generally the first decade of our membership was much better than the second half. Look, as far as euro is concerned, I think euro has, I told you this already, euro has still a very strong support in Slovenia, in spite of all this Eurozone crisis and so on. I think the people, if you would go today to the kind of the polls for vote for euros, I think we would still have 80%, very strong. So even though this financial crisis, the people consider euro as one of the major benefits of this process of EU integration. And once again, because, we are basically 80% on the export side. So we travel a lot. Slovenia is very small. Everything is 50 kilometers to the border. Is it Austria? Is it Italy? But really go back and forth, and having one currency is very convenient for a daily life. So I would say that if I make a kind of a summary, I would say that during these 20 years of the EU membership, we did make some, of course, real approach to the EU average, a real convergence. But let's be fair here that other new members were doing this quicker, deeper than we are. So we are a little bit slow. What you can say is that we did not use this opportunity of the membership as good as I would maybe like to. And as I said, particularly the second decade was because of that financial crisis, a very, very, let's say, expensive one.
So post-COVID, you don't see any changes?
Post-COVID, I think here we are more or less doing similarly as the other countries. We return to the growth path. But let's be fair, here we all live on the fiscal side, which is abnormal. Let's be frank, guys, here. This 4 years without the fiscal limits was a little bit of a Wild West in terms of public finances. So this The new fiscal rules were introduced now a couple of weeks ago. Let's see how this will work. This, in my view, this is one of the major macroeconomic issues for the next few years of the EU, is how to consolidate two fiscally completely two opposite orientations. One is fiscal consolidation, and the other side, there is a demand for increased investments. I'm not talking here just about green. I'm talking here a number of new investment priorities. These things simply do not go together. So what would happen? I would not like to speculate, but one possibility is that the investments will be slower than it would be useful. Another possibility is that the fiscal rules will not be respected. And the third possibility is that we would significantly increase the budget at the EU level. And something like we have done after the COVID with this new generation EU. I would not be surprised that we will face some similar type of financial instruments in the forthcoming periods.
Okay. I must say it has been super interesting. I learned a lot, even though after reading the book. And thank you very much, Professor Mrak. It was a treat.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good.